All right. Hello, everyone. Thank you so much for joining us. My name is Nicole, and I'm a communications manager here at Sonatype. I am live from DUS with Dr. Stephen Magill, VP of Product Innovation here at Sonatype, to discuss the recent release of our State of the Software Supply Chain Report. Thank you, Stephen, so much for taking the time to join us.
Yeah, thank you for having me. I'm excited to talk about this.
Yeah, me too. All right, so I know earlier today you gave a discussion here at DUS about some of this year's findings. So I thought we kind of start off just by touching on some of the key themes and what some of your biggest takeaways were.
Yeah, sure. So, each year we try to do a deep dive into some new area of supply chain risk management, learn something new about what the community is doing, and ideally come up with either some new best practices or examine sort of existing wisdom and
Right.
see if it holds up. And so, I think there's a number of sort of interesting findings of that sort this year. One is on, well, I think the biggest thing that the report this year really highlights is that the risk we see in open source is largely a consumption problem. So if you look at the open source projects that are out there, most of them, most projects have a secure version that you can be using.
Right.
So, we found that 4% of projects don't, like the latest version of that project has some vulnerability that's not patched. Obviously that could be better. It could be smaller than 4%. But that means that 96% of the projects that you might be using, there is a version that you can move to that patches any vulnerabilities that are known in that project. However, so that's sort of good from a supplier perspective, but from a consumption perspective, what we see is a whole lot of vulnerable components being pulled in. So 62, I believe, percent of the components that are downloaded from Maven Central that are vulnerable don't need to be pulled down, right? There's a newer version of that project that's not vulnerable, that whoever is downloading that release, they should be using that other version instead. It works out to about 1.2 billion vulnerable downloads per month on Maven Central.
So billion, right? Billion.
Billion,
Okay.
yeah. I mean, there's a lot of downloads from Maven Central,
Yeah.
but and it's sad because those are all preventable. Like that's the number of preventable vulnerable downloads that are being consumed every month. And, it just sort of gets worse when you look at the application level, right? So that's, those are individual components. The average Java application contains 148 dependencies. And so if you think about that, and then the likelihood that, one of those dependencies that you're pulling down is one of these vulnerable versions that, you could be using a better version of it, like that increases the odds at the application level quite a bit. So at the application level, we see 68% of applications containing at least one component with a known vulnerability. So, those are like, people like to focus a lot on the numbers on the supplier side, that there's like millions of vulnerable components up on Maven Central. There's lots of CVEs, that apply to open source, all these sort of security advisories coming out. But the numbers you should be worried about are the consumption side numbers, right? Which is, in a sense, good because that's what you have direct control over.
Right.
But, we're not seeing people sort of taking the steps that they need to take to really secure that part of their supply chain.
So what do you think is driving most of this risk, or why do you think those consumption patterns are happening?
Yeah, I think, I think it's a combination of, in some cases, just not paying attention. Like if you don't have visibility into it, then you sort of don't even realize that this is going on. And in the other case, lack of capacity to sort of keep up with things. I hear a lot about people, who do have tools in place and are scanning, saying, we find all these security issues, we just don't have time to remediate all of them. And so, and I get that. I get that challenge. I mentioned that there's 148 dependencies on average in an average Java application. The average project releases 10 versions per year. So that's about 1,500 upgrades that you would have to do if you want to stay fully
on top of everything else. Yeah.
Yeah.
Awesome. Okay. Well, so that being said, that makes sense. So then how do you recommend, like, what are the best ways to pull the best projects, or what methods do you use to determine that?
Yeah. So one, I mentioned, each year we try and do some novel, deep analysis of some question that's on our minds, right? And given the statistics I just mentioned of 1,500 updates per year for an average job applications dependencies, we wondered, could you choose projects in a way that makes it less likely that those updates would be security relevant, right? Because the fewer of those that are security patches, the less you have to keep on top of if your goal is just to stay secure.
Right.
And so we looked at projects to see, are there development practices that are associated with lower vulnerability rates? And to do that analysis, we went to this framework called the Open Ssf Scorecard, so the Open Ssf Security Scorecard. So Open Ssf is the open source security foundation. And they've defined this scorecard system as a way, first of all, to provide transparency into the development practices of open source. And then by doing that, and hopefully, sort of using that transparency to drive change in the community, they want to, cause more and more open source projects to adopt these best practices. And so these are things like doing code review, doing fuzz testing, having unit tests in your CI pipeline, having branch protection enabled so people can't just, push code to the main branch. There's some sort of approval process. And so we took that scorecard data and we paired it with vulnerability information over the last few years to see, are there certain practices that are associated with lower vulnerability rates? And we use machine learning to do this analysis because sort of cutting to the chase, there is a connection. It's more complicated than just, you should sum all these up. And if you're doing the more you're doing, the better, right? Some of these, there are complex relationships between them. For example, code review is more effective if you also have branch protection enabled. And so, we applied a random forest classifier, which is a particular type of machine learning algorithm that's able to to discover those more complex relationships. And what we found is we were able to fit the data pretty well, certainly better than I expected. There's a lot of randomness in the security, like the vulnerability discovery process, right? Some projects get a lot more scrutiny from the security community than others. And, it's just the process of like spending a day banging on an open source component and trying to find vulnerabilities in it. Like that's, sometimes it works out. Sometimes you bang on it in just the right way and sometimes you don't. And, there's some randomness to that, some luck involved, right? And so what we saw was a 78% accuracy level for this model that we trained, which, in my mind shows that there is a good amount of signal there in those best practices. And so what we did then was we sort of augmented that model with another statistic that we track that we think is important called MTTU, or mean time to update. This is just a measure of how on top of updating dependencies a particular project is, how quickly they update those dependencies when new versions come out. So we threw all that into the model, is sort of trained it, and got up to 86% accuracy. And then what's really exciting is we liked these results. We were like, this seems useful. How can we get this out there? And so we actually, from the model, extracted a score that we're calling the Sonatype safety rating, and made that available publicly on Maven Central and on OSS Index. So people can go and see the output of that model, which is great, because we've done analyses like this in the past in the supply chain report. We've developed things like MTTU, that metric I just told you about, that tells you how up to date you are. But when we've said, pay attention to this, but there's never been really like a public repository of those results. And with a machine learning model like this, it's very hard to sort of describe the model itself or share it. But, by putting the ratings that it produces out there, I think it gives a level of insight and transparency to this that we haven't had in the past. So I'm really, really excited to have that available and see what people think about it.
Yeah, that's super exciting. I can't wait to see it roll out. Well, great. So for developers reading this report, what is the one thing you would want them to take away from this? Would it be that correlation, or would it be the container or the consumer maintainer conversation?
Yeah, I think it would be it would be the fact that there's still a lot of work to be done on the consumption side. And I think there's another finding from this year's report that I think is important to keep in mind along with that fact that it's a consumption side problem. Right. And that is that we found there wasn't really a lot of awareness of the level of risk that exists sort of on the consumption side. So we do a survey every year as part of the report where we ask people about their development practices at their organization, their level of confidence in their security posture. And we sort of consistently find very optimistic assessments of organizations' security. And this year we were able to do a bit more digging and really compare the self-reported data to what we see in reality when we look at scans of applications that are using open source. And to give you an example of two statistics that are sort of at odds, in the self-reported data, 68% of respondents said that they were confident that they weren't using any vulnerable components in any of their applications. In the data that we looked at on actual vulnerabilities in applications, we found that 68% of applications contained at least one vulnerable component. So you've got almost all my applications are totally fine, and then you've got most applications are vulnerable, and those two are at odds with each other. And I think the data is correct in this case. I think people just don't realize how much risk there is in the software that they're producing. I think the other really important aspect of that survey data was the finding that this sort of optimistic view of things, it was even more optimistic when you looked at the management level. So managers were 3.5 times more likely to say that their organizations could very quickly remediate security issues in their application portfolio. And that's worrisome because, it's those managers, those executives that are making decisions about how to invest resources, what parts of their application security program require more attention, or maybe, more tooling or new processes to be introduced. And if those people don't have the right data, then they can't make effective decisions there.
Right.
So, I don't know the solution to that. Maybe next year we'll talk to some people in those positions and find out what they did to get a more accurate sense of where their organization is. But I think that's super important in improving things.
Yeah, that's what I was going to ask. If you had a piece of advice for those in leadership or a takeaway from the report for them, what would that be?
Yeah, I guess I would encourage them to either, if they're already doing scanning, try to collect the data and look at it. Like you can't argue with data, right? And so, but it's amazing how many organizations deploy tools and then don't have, really a process in place to look at usage, to look at aggregated scan data, to see how they're performing over time, and just get a sense of, where their organization is at, and give themselves some sort of grade. And so I think that's really important. If you're collecting those statistics centrally and you can do that across your portfolio, then you're in a good position, right?
Yeah, I love that idea that the data doesn't lie. Well, great. So one last question for you. What was your favorite part of this process working on the report this year?
I just always love the scramble. So, it's like the report, it's, I think this often happens with these sorts of things. You have, on the one hand, a lot of people and resources focused on collecting data, doing, analyses and pulling the results together and sort of figuring out what is the story that you're seeing from all of these experiments you're running, and trying to convey that. Like, that's a really exciting process. At the same time, you have, a goal in mind, a deadline usually of when you want to get things out, and those two things, on the one hand, it can lead to a lot of, late nights, but on the other hand, it injects a lot of energy into the process. And I just really love how energized everybody gets when the results start coming in and you start seeing interesting things.
Yeah. Awesome. Well, Stephen, thank you again so much for joining us. And for everyone else, be sure to check out Sonatype's 8th annual State of the Software Supply Chain Report at sonatype.com. Thank you.